Urban Odyssey, a bicentennial project of the D.C. Community Humanities Council.
At the turn of the 20th century, Washington, D.C. represented hope for many newcomers. Hope for the economic and social advancement promised to those who worked hard and embraced American ideals and ethics. But for many, the rewards were not so easy to obtain. For Chinese migrants to the city, America was still an unfulfilled promise. When C.C. Hung arrived in Washington, D.C. in the 1930s, he found his Chinese compatriots struggling to establish an identity and an honorable way of life. Washington's Chinatown had just been forcefully relocated from its original site on Pennsylvania Avenue, not far from the White House, to its current location on H Street Northwest. C.C. Hung, first pastor of the Chinese Community Church, was one of the central forces in the consolidation of Washington's Chinese community. He saw the need to build upon the strong traditions the Chinese immigrant retained. But he also understood that life in the District of Columbia represented a challenge to their way of life. Before his death in 1978, Reverend Hung had become one of the city's icons, building bridges between as well as within communities. In this segment of the D.C. Community Humanities Council's Urban Odyssey series, meet Reverend C.C. Hung, a voice from Washington's Chinese community.
Oh, Mr. Jones, good evening. Yes, please, come in. Have a seat. No, you're not disturbing us. We were just about to have a glass of tea. Would you like to have a glass? Florence, it's the landlord. Yes, we saw that crowd when we were coming in, but we were so busy unpacking we didn't bother to see what was going on. Oh. They came to you about us. What about us? Oh, is that what they said? Yes, we should know about this. And what did you say? Good thinking. If you've already spent the first month's rent, what could you do? Yes, good tactic. Yes, it was good of you to stop by, Mr. Jones. And thank you for saying those nice things about us. Good night, Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones. Thank you. Well, Florence, what did you think of that? Our neighbors rose up in protest against us. Yes, of course it's stupid. They should be glad to have us live on their street. With your masters and mine, I bet you we have more degrees than they've ever seen. A Christian minister and his lawyer wife. What better neighbors could you ask for? Yes, of course it makes me furious. Perhaps you're right. Maybe that's the only tack to take. We'll have to show them what we are and win them over. That was our first night in Washington, D.C., in our new home at 506 11th Street Northwest, 37 years ago. Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Excuse me if I'm a little bit slow now, but I had a stroke last year and, well, the doctor has told me to take it easy. Well, I guess you're all here to hear me talk about my life and about my work. But this is all really very difficult for me. You see, it goes against all my upbringing as a Chinese gentleman. You see, a good Chinese gentleman does not brag about himself. No, that is what children do. They say, Mommy and Daddy, watch me kick this ball. See me do a somersault. But a good Chinese gentleman does not brag about his accomplishments. His character and his accomplishments are in his deeds, and his deeds speak for themselves. It is not for me to speak of them. However, that is what they want me to do, and here I am. I don't really know why the spotlight has been focused on me, why I've been asked to represent the Chinese community, or rather the Asian American community. You see, that job is really very difficult. There are so many of us Asians here in Washington. There are the Japanese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, the Indians from India, the Thais, and most recently the Indo-Chinese, all of them with their own history, culture, and stories. Still, there are many others with very interesting stories to tell. For example, Ruby Fu, who made so much money from a restaurant that she could buy a string of racehorses and a fleet of expensive cars and a showcase of a home. But of course, she was rather a flamboyant character. On the quiet side, we had Yin Hong Chin, who operated a hand laundry here for 50 years. He would often work 6.5 days out of 7. And sometimes at 3 a.m., you could still see him sweating at his ironing board. When his friends would ask him why he worked so hard, he would tell them, "Every extra shirt I iron means extra dime. Every extra dime means I can send my children to college, make them upstanding citizens." He had 10 children. 9 of them went to college. 1 decided not to go. So to me, Yin Hong Chin is a hero. But prejudice has very deep roots. The Chinese first learned this when we arrived in California during the gold rush in the 1850s. Special laws were created preventing us from working mines unless they had been abandoned by whites first. Other laws were created preventing us from owning land, from working governments or corporations, from attending white schools, from marrying whites, from giving evidence in court. And this made us easy targets for robberies and other crimes. All that was left for us to do was so-called women's work, washing and cooking. That's why so many Chinese had laundries and restaurants. Still, the old-timers in San Diego had some horror stories to tell of how the Chinese were treated once the railroads were finished. The men were strung up by their queues and stoned. One of the most horrifying stories occurred in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885. A white mob, guns blasting, drove the Chinese into the hills. 28 Chinese were murdered, and not one white man even received a fine for this massacre. You saw what happened to us when we moved to Washington here in 1935. The sequel to that story is that by the time the month was over, Florence and I had made some friends and proven that we could be good neighbors. So everyone forgot about not wanting a Chinese family in their neighborhood. In fact, the generous ones even apologized. "Oh, hello, Florence. Yes, thank you for bringing us some tea. Would you like to have some tea with us? It's jasmine. I know that most Americans prefer strong black tea, but this is the kind we like best." "Oh, can't you stay? I was just telling them about our first night here in Washington." "Oh, that's right. Wellington's children are playing in the garden." No, of course, I won't forget about tonight. Yes, it'll be a short visit, just 20 minutes or so. Yes, I'll be there. Wellington is our eldest son. He and his wife Blanche have gone out for the afternoon and, well, Florence is looking after the kids. Wellington and Kenneth, our sons, are both doctors now, like my dad, and very busy. But to go back to the story of how I made Washington my home, my motto has always been, find a need and fill it. When I came to Washington, I found two major needs. The first was within the Chinese community itself. The community was split into two main merchant associations called Tongs, the Yonglung and the Hip Sing. Instead of working together, these two groups competed with each other. Sometimes the conflicts would become so heated they would erupt into the so-called Tong Wars. When Florence and I arrived in 1935, members of one group were not speaking to members of the other. So what was missing in Chinatown was a sense of community and unity. And that I found as my special purpose. The second big need I found was between the community and the city itself. So many whites and blacks too had only contempt and prejudice for the Chinese. All they knew about the Chinese was what they read in the newspapers or saw in the movie theaters. The gambling halls, opium dens, and hatchet murders. And so many Chinese too had only suspicion and fear of the whites and blacks. To go back to the old days, I'm speaking roughly now of 1880 to 1935. Chinatown was located on 3rd and 4.5 Street on Pennsylvania Avenue. By 1927, the federal government had decided that it needed this property for its own buildings and gave notice to the residents to move out. The Yonglung Tung were the first to buy up and lease 11 properties on 6th and 7th Street on H Street in 1931. Once again, the residents protested, but this time they lost. Present-day Chinatown on H Street between 5th and 8th Street was already in place by the time Florence and I arrived. Chinatown had a population then of approximately 800 people, almost all men, because it was against the law for the men to bring their wives from China, and it was against another law for the men to marry whites. Chinatown had quite a few restaurants, and small shops and laundries, but everyone was too tired and busy to think about going to church. Restaurants and laundries had long hours then, and of course those were the days before automatic washing machines and dryers. But on the whole, the Chinese people are not a religious people. Christianity had been a part of my family's religion for a long time. We were descendants of Hong Shui Chuan, the leader of the Taiping Rebellion during the 1850s. Hong was a charismatic preacher and a Christian convert. He believed that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Crazy as that may sound, but his eloquent words moved thousands in a campaign to overthrow the Manchu emperor. He conquered half of China before he was stopped. My grandfather was the dean of Canton Theological Seminary, and you might say it was in my genes for me to join the Christian ministry. But as I said, evangelizing wasn't my main purpose. You see, I wanted to show my concern for all the people in the Chinese community. So I gave everyone my phone number and told them to contact me whenever they needed help, whether it be spiritual, physical, or informational. I remember one particular time the phone woke us out of a deep sleep. It was 2 a.m. Hello. Yes, this is Reverend Hong. Oh, what? Yes, I'll be there right away. Hold on. Who's speaking? Operator, I need to know where that call came from. It's an emergency. The man is in great pain and he needs help right away. Yes, I'll wait. Liu Pan. That's right. His voice was so husky, I didn't recognize it. Yes, thank you, operator. Yes, I have his address. Thank you. Florence, since you're already awake, please call an ambulance and have them go to Liu Pan's right away while I'm getting dressed. We had many stories like that. Emergency childbirths, accidents, and sometimes even murders. But sometimes folks would just call just to find out information on how to fill out an immigration form or a job application. Many folks would tell us that they would keep our phone number at the top of their list, above the police and fire departments, because, well, their English wasn't good enough for Americans to understand. But of course, many of us also thought that America was our motherland, and about 150 Chinese from Washington joined the American Armed Forces. Our church organized a USO and formed a Sunday evening worship and social program for the Chinese American GI stationed here. Remember my motto? Find a need and fill it. Strangely enough, the war also had some good consequences. For one thing, it brought the Chinese community together. No more Tong wars. Families were now made to be possible. Before the war, as I said, Chinatown was 90% male. But after the war, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was repealed, and, well, now men were allowed to bring their wives from China. Chinatown was no longer a bachelor society. No more prostitution or gambling halls. Babies were now born. In fact, Chinatown also shrank somewhat because, well, families were now allowed to move to other parts of the city without protest. After the war, I organized the Consolidated Chinese Benevolent Association. I was elected the first president. In this way, the various family associations and Tong groups were kept together. We were so few, what could we accomplish by fighting amongst each other? Of course, the Chinese in China were fighting a civil war during the late 40s. And when the communists won, many of us loyal Americans went on the side of Taiwan, and some went on the side of Mao. So, once again, there was a division in the community, but this time it was more of a splinter than a split. The silence imposed by the bamboo curtain for these 30-some years has been painful for many of us. But now that rupture seems close to healing. With the opening of U.S.-Chinese relations, families that have been separated all these years may now soon have the opportunity to come together again. And that is cause for great rejoicing. If I may impose on you a bit longer, I would like to tell you something about the Chinese Community Church. You see, the church began as the brainchild of Dr. Pak Chu Chan, the director of the Central Hospital in Canton. In 1934, Dr. Chan arrived here in Washington to take some brush-up courses at George Washington University, where he'd gotten his degree. Dr. Chan envisioned a church that would bring together the Chinese community. First, he gathered several influential and American and Chinese officials together and asked them to help. By May of 1935, the church was incorporated under the city's laws with a board of managers from different denominations throughout the city. They were able to raise a modest salary for a minister. I was then pastor of a church in Detroit, but was excited and pleased to be invited to the nation's capital. You see, I saw this as a great opportunity to do some very important work. First, our numbers gradually grew. We first began the church with only 35 members, but now we have about 250. One of the major needs with the Chinese community and with any immigrant community, well, is the need to bridge the generation gap. It's not so much an age gap as it is a cultural gap. You see, the older generation wants to preserve the culture and language that it grew up with, while the younger generation wants to be totally American. For example, Popo, Grandma, likes to tell the children stories of how people drowned in the village well and who rise up, wrinkled, bloated, hair dripping to pull down a substitute, while young Mary Jane longs to be a high-stepping, white-booted baton twirler in the school parades. So, at the Chinese Community Church, we try to bridge this gap. We teach Chinese culture and language to the youngsters so that they may communicate to their elders and, well, preserve their heritage. And we also teach English and citizenship so that, well, the older generation may adjust to life here in the United States. It's a struggle because neither side is willing to make sacrifices for the other. But in the end, both sides finally accept the fact that something of themselves is in the other, and they want to make that part less strange. The final big need we had, of course, was the actual raising of the funds for the building of the church. I traveled to the Chinese communities of New York, Chicago, and San Francisco and Honolulu and asked for their donations. Although I had begun raising for funds for a church when I arrived here in Washington, the war had stopped us in our tracks. And to quote the black poet Langston Hughes, my granddaughter told me about the other day, my dream had to be deferred. We were able to purchase an empty lot and row house in 1939 at 1011 L Street Northwest. Many of our members thought that this site was too far away from Chinatown, but when the owner found out that we were going to build a church there, well, she lowered her price. So you might say it was too good of an opportunity to let go by. By December 27th, 1957, we had our first service in our own building. Florence, I'm going to take these people on a tour of the church. I'll meet you there later. As you can see, the architectural design of the church is very distinctive. The red brick facade is topped with upturned corners in the style of Chinese temples. A large cross sits on the roof. This symbolizes both the Christian and Chinese aspects unique to our church. The interior of the sanctuary is plain, but the large red velvet curtain was donated through the fundraising efforts of Florence and our women's group. The black metal fretwork around the curtain and the long hanging type lanterns give a Chinese atmosphere. Otherwise, there is no adornment. Like other Protestant churches, we prefer the plain look. No statues, no incense, no intercessors between us and God. Now that my main dreams have been fulfilled, What do I want? Well, I'd like to see this church grow. I'd like to see people helping other people, growing, laughing, learning, teaching. Nowadays, people feel that, well, that religion isn't important to daily life anymore. And judging by the number of people that attend services nowadays, well, a large number of those people belong to that group I call, now no offense meant, the Seventh-day absentees. Somebody once told me that the prayer of the Seventh-day absentee is, give us this day our day in bed. Of course, I disagree. I say, wake up, get out of bed. So much remains to be done. There are millions of needs that have to be filled, and each of us should be doing our part to fill them. My part has been in this small corner in the Chinese community. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you why this day is so special to me. Well, remember that I told you that we took out a loan for $75,000 back in 1956? Since then, we've been paying $563 each month. Sometimes I didn't know where that money was going to come from. Somehow, God always provided. Today, February 18th, 1972, do you know what we're going to do? Well, we're going to have a very special celebration. We're going to burn the mortgage papers. That's right. The church is all paid for, and well, now it finally belongs to the community at last. Now, won't you come along and help us celebrate?